Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I make sense of what's happening in the news, technology, business, and beyond through the lens of economics. Let's jump right in. Hello, sir.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, it's going great. I'm here in New York. How are you doing?
Oh, awesome. What are you up to in New York?
I am at two conferences. There was a media conference yesterday and a venture capital conference tomorrow.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I try to go every couple months, or every 3 months, at least every quarter, see some friends. You having a good week so far?
Oh, yeah. All right.
Cool. How do we pronounce the guy who just won the Nobel Prize and who wrote Why Nations Failed? How do you pronounce the last name?
Acemoglu?
Acemoglu.
I mean, I think the Turkish pronunciation is more like Acemoglu, but like, I think he just goes by Acemoglu. He's not born in America.
Okay. I want to get into his book and I want to get into his thoughts on AI because they touch upon another piece you wrote recently. But first, maybe we just zoom out. You had this interesting reflection on the Nobel and how sort of the prize in economics, it signified a little bit of a change this year, where you wrote about how we were moving to this idea that the field is something of a natural science that has sort of, can be measured empirically and has more practical applications, but has sort of moved to back what it used to be, which is more around who has more cultural influence in the field, separate from perhaps its real world impact. Is that how you see it, or when you talk about broad reflections on the
Right. So traditionally, if you give a physics prize, it's because you discovered a real thing in physics that works. Either you made an invention that works, like, I don't know, fiber optic cable or something, or you make or this year they gave it for AI, which is kind of, I don't know, a little weird, but AI is a tool. It's a digital tool, but a fiber optic cable is a physical tool. But the thing is that if you made a theory that didn't actually match observations, that didn't, explain data, like that you couldn't actually use, you wouldn't win a Nobel Prize for that. And you still won't. So like, you'll notice that no one has ever won the Nobel Prize for string theory. There's a reason for that, because no one's ever managed to find evidence for string theory. And so, like, Ed Witten is a freaking genius and has done, arguably more work than anyone else in the string theory field. And he won a Fields Medal for it. Like, he invented important new math just to do string theory, and actually won the most prestigious prize in math, which is actually harder to get than the Nobel Prize, statistically speaking. Plus, you have to do it before 40. And yet he hasn't won a Nobel Prize, and he never will, because, string theory doesn't work, or at least yet. Maybe someday it will, but no one's ever found a way to test it, to match it to experiment. So that's how physics prize works. In chemistry, biology, similar stuff. But medicine prize. But in economics, if you look at who gets the prize, it was people with influential ideas within the economics profession. So that could be anyone from people like Hayek, who just, his stuff was all written down in sort of like expansive discourses of words. Today he'd be a blogger, right? But then, he didn't do math. But then, so people like that. And then, later on, it was often given to people who made theories that could never really be proven, or which were just like dead on arrival because they didn't match anything from the data. So like in 2004, they gave it to this theory called real business cycle theory, or RBC. And what RBC says is that recessions and booms are due to changes in the rate of innovation, technological innovation. And or you could have policies like taxes, like self-inflicted stuff, but primarily it's just like, this year our engineers discovered more stuff, and that's why economies get better and worse. And then when suddenly you have this giant flood of mass unemployment, it's because we discovered things at a slower rate, and so people's wages won't grow as fast, and so people are like, what, I'll take some vacation by just quitting my job. I'll just take some years off of work. That is not a very good match to anything like that. You can just show all kinds of data showing that this is full of crap, from data on the rate of productivity growth to the data on people quitting their jobs, or just all kinds of things. Like, this is not a good model for how the economy works. But it was very influential, and the math that they used to do it was not very hard math, but it was math that people liked because it was hard enough to to sort of, well, I could speculate on why people liked it, but anyway, the point is that math became very popular in macroeconomic modeling. That math is something we call dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, or DSGE, if you've ever seen that name.
Now we're getting to the good stuff.
Right. So 2004, we got the prize for that. That's how the economics Nobel was for a very long time. And so, but in recent years, I would say the last 10 years, and especially the last like 6 or 7 years, we've seen a shift, and we saw a shift toward empirical stuff. And now this shift follows at a lag a big shift in the economics profession. So around the 1990s, but really starting in the 2000s, economics started to get much, much more empirical. Data became much more, and statistics became much more of a thing. Whereas, theory alone sort of declined rapidly. And, this is all because of computerization, right? We got better tools. And so when you get computerization, when running a regression doesn't require getting at your paper spreadsheets and then doing a whole bunch of calculations and blah, 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 blah for one simple little regression, where you can just run a million regressions with like a little script that you make, then, the cost of doing empirical work fell. And so people started doing data stuff, and lo and behold, a lot of the data stuff they found really contradicted a lot of the leading theory. And so, however, at the same time, you had a shift in theory, whereas people who were working on sort of fundamental theory, the actually difficult math stuff, they largely shifted from doing macro models where you'd model like the whole economy, to doing micro things about how like agents interact in an auction. And I'm not talking about shifts of specific people, although there were a few of those. I'm talking about shifts in just like, if you're a smart person coming up in the econ world who does math, what kind of theory do you work on? And there was this shift, I think, from general equilibrium, which you can see declining a lot in the number of papers that use it, and an increase in game theory, Nash equilibrium and things like that, strategic interactions, instead of this sort of like, let's throw everything together into a big imaginary economy and see what pops out. So there was this shift toward game theory. And one thing is that shift made economic theory much more practical. So you saw, for example, the Google is entirely powered with auctions designed by a leading auction theorist, Hal Varian, and so that's how they use these auctions to predict how much people will pay for ads. And that's incredibly useful to Google's business model. And so, lots of online sites, Amazon, eBay, all those people always used like pricing strategies that economists would come up with, like basically theories that you could then test really, well in real time. And of course, now with AIs trading against each other, you have new theories. So there was a shift toward that. Plus, like, the algorithms that we use to assign kidney donors to recipients, those were economists made that up, or to match medical students with like their residency places, those matching algorithms, that like economists won a Nobel Prize for that. They made that up. And so you saw this, and then in all kinds of things like, auctions and competition policy and blah, 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 you've seen a closer correspondence between theory and practice. And then sometimes they still give the prize to macro people, but it's often something that's extremely like currently policy relevant, right? Like, so for example, Bernanke got it for doing, macro models that involved the financial sector. Well, he was heavily involved in, applying those models in real time to the Great Recession. And so, but what you haven't seen as much in recent years is big think, is like taking on, like attacking these gigantic questions. And you've seen some old guys like Lant Pritchett, like Angus Deaton. You've seen old guys criticize the Nobel Prize for not focusing on the big issues, for focusing on people who get, more credible answers to small bore questions, like, does this education program help these kids in Ethiopia, right? You can get a pretty good answer to that. It's actually a lot harder than you think, but you can eventually get a pretty good answer to that. But or does minimum wage cause a lot of unemployment, or does like a big surge of low skilled immigration actually hurt the job market for native born people? And so those are all questions that people sort of won Nobel Prizes for asking in recent years. And so then people said, those are too small bore. You need to look at big things. And so I think this prize shows more, it's more about big think. It's the first big think prize in a while. So who got it? Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson got it for their theory of institutions, inclusive institutions. The idea that when you have a society whose sort of rules and systems are set up to include the opinions and the talents and the preferences of the vast majority of people, then that country will grow faster over the long run and do better than a country that simply treats people as a resource to be exploited. And that's the big think prize.
And why Acemoglu? I know he's, as you write, he's a beast of a researcher, but like, what are his great contributions? I know that you've viewed some of his works, somewhat skeptically. Obviously, no denying his prolificness, but
I view a lot of his work very skeptically. I think that it may be related to his prolificness. When you take that many shots on goal, you're going to miss some. But I think he could probably stand to slow down and do some of these things a little more carefully.
But what do you think is his great contribution, basically?
You mean if I had to pick one great contribution by Acemoglu and say this is his big thing? I don't know what I'd pick. But you have to pick, if you're going to give he dominates top journal publishing. Like he is the beast. He's the closest thing that econ has to Terence Tao in terms of how much he publishes.
But if he wasn't around, would we have a different understanding? Is there something that would be missing in our understanding of modern economics or something? I mean, I do want to shift to
There would certainly be differences in the way economists think about things. So the institution stuff has been incredibly influential within the economics profession and in the public through books like Why Nations Fail that he wrote with Robinson. So that stuff has really, really affected a lot of public discourse, and a ton of economists have made their whole careers, doing research and following this up. Similarly, his work on AI and automation is incredibly influential it's influential within the public discussion, but also in, tons of people. If Acemoglu writes about something, 100 people will follow that up and write papers about that. Maybe not 100, maybe 20. But yeah, so in terms of influence, there's been a ton. But in terms of how much we actually know about the world versus if Acemoglu had decided to go be an electrical engineer, I don't know what I'd say. I don't know what I'd pick, because I think that the institution stuff, although I like the idea, it's an idea I really like personally, I don't think it's been proven or validated to anything resembling the degree where I can say that we know this or we know that. There's just not much we know about it.
Let's talk about his book, Why Nations Fail, because that's been widely read and impactful, certainly when it came out. I'm curious how it holds up. And just to zoom out, there's been a lot of people who've written about why nations succeed and fail. And, Peter Zeihan has this, he focuses on, demographics, geography, and energy. Someone like Balaji focuses a lot on human capital and technological capacity. And Acemoglu seems to focus on the quality of institutions. And that's kind of a broad term. It's unclear to what extent culture is wrapped up in or tied into that. How do you kind of evaluate Acemoglu's claim that he makes in his book? We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
You like to optimize things. You've chosen the perfect credit card to maximize your travel points, and you always find the fastest route when you drive. Shouldn't you handle your charitable giving the same way? GiveWell spends 50,000 hours every year doing deep dives into different charitable programs to try to find the ways to do the most good for your dollar. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. It's easy to see why the Boston Globe called GiveWell the gold standard for giving. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. Go to givewell.org to find out more or make a donation. Select podcast and enter Econ 102 at checkout to make sure they know you heard about them from us. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.
What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Inflation's up or down. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 38,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days, not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to your immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning for free at netsuite.com/102. That's netsuite.com/102. netsuite.com/102.
Right. So first of all, I think it looks right to me. in at least, I think it's part of what's going on based on casual observation. So you look at North Korea versus South Korea, right? South Korea, you can start a business, you can vote, you can do all these things, and South Korea is very rich. North Korea, you can't do any of that stuff, and so people just spend most of their time trying to like dodge the security services, or whatever. And so like, and you can. So South Korea or North Korea is poor, right? You look at East Germany versus West Germany. Obviously, institutions matter in some sense, right? Like they can matter huge. Like you can fuck up your country bad. You can screw it up. You can screw it all up. You can take a good thing and you can just waste it, right? But whether historically that was the main thing that made some countries get rich before other countries is an open question. It can work, and I do believe that inclusive institutions are important based on casual observation of just how things work. I think that, and in terms of technologies too, technologies that, unleash the talents and skills of a ton of people tend to be more successful than technologies that unleash the skills of only a few people. And so I think that's basically right about what's going on in the world. But my thinking that it's right is not science, right? It's just like, obviously there are so many issues that are too big for science right now. Social issues like, war and peace. Like, yeah, there's people who do game theory about that, and you can do some statistical analyses. But I think ultimately, like, so much of that is beyond current science, and you just have to go with your you can do empirics, you can look at data, but that doesn't make it science, right? That doesn't make it as validated as like Newton's laws of motion or like the germ theory of disease or any of those things, right? You can gather data, you can get like, informed. Basically, it's what we use is informed guesswork because these things are too big to be put in a lab and studied. And we do the best we can, and that it doesn't mean we should just completely reject empirics and go with our gut. It means that our conclusions will never be as reliable as for science. And so I think that that's true in the case of institutions too, because when you look at, so for example, Acemoglu's most famous paper, Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson, their most famous paper looked at European colonies. And they said, which of these European colonies got rich over the centuries and which didn't? They look at the ones that got rich now, America, Canada, Australia, Singapore, places like that. And they say, okay, those places have what we would call good institutions. Now they have property rights, they have rule of law, they have all these things that we think are good. Now let's look at the history of those colonies. And what they found is that places where colonists themselves died, usually of tropical diseases, did not get, now are not the places that are rich, not the places with good institutions either. So that would be like Nigeria, right? If you're European, you can't really go settle much in Nigeria in the 1700s, 1800s, because malaria and a million other things like that will just kill you, right? Tropical diseases will you'll die. You're not set up to resist those diseases, whereas Nigerians sort of have endemic resistance to those diseases, but they die a lot too. But basically because of that, so Acemoglu and Johnson Robinson said, okay, what happened was when Europeans could move in, they set up property rights and other institutions, rule of law for themselves, for their own benefit. And when they couldn't move in, they didn't set that up. They just sort of relied on their armies or local cronies to kind of extract mineral resources, and then just didn't really change the system of government much. And that's their explanation. And then some other economists like Ed Glazer came along and said, look, I hate to tell you this, but there's another obvious explanation for why places like America, Canada, and Australia did well and places like Nigeria and Pakistan did not do well. And that's that people moving in bring human capital with them. So if you're like an engineer who knows how to build some machine or whatever, right, in the 1800s, you don't go to Nigeria and you don't have Nigerian friends that you tell about it, right? Nigeria is part of the British Empire, but because it doesn't have many like British people in it, there's not many people that you can share this with. There's not many people that can, start a company in Nigeria that does engineering and then like link up with Britain, sell stuff to the British market and, whatever, buy parts from the British suppliers. Just those connections aren't there, and that know-how isn't there, and all that stuff just isn't there because there's very little, because most of the stuff is just personal connections, and personal education, culture, whatever. And so because of that, Europeans moving in, so Acemoglu et al. Thought that Europeans moving in forced them to develop good institutions, which then benefited them over the centuries. And then these other, Glazer, et cetera, said, no, it's just that they moved in and their descendants stayed there in those, whatever. That's it. And so who's right? We don't know. But, oh, and this is, by the way, Acemoglu, Johnson Robinson wrote another paper called Reversal of Fortune, where they show that places that were poor, by which they mean places that were not very urbanized, in 1500 became a lot richer among European colonies only. So they looked at but where are those? Where are the places that were poor and not urbanized before the Europeans got there? They were America, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Canada. Those are those places, right? And then, or maybe some places in Latin America too, like Chile, Argentina, and then a bunch of Europeans moved in to those places, and those are the places that ended up getting rich, and the places that didn't. But once you take that out, once you account for that, you definitely see the places that were richer when Europe colonized them are richer now. So I think these empirical results are pretty shaky. They rely on some assumptions that a sparsely inhabited North America was sort of the same raw material as a densely populated Nigeria, Pakistan, that probably just don't hold true. That doesn't mean I think that inclusive institutions are not important or that the institutional theory of development is wrong. I just think that we haven't confirmed it. And the Nobel Prize Committee saw fit to include a disclaimer in its explanation of the prize saying that you can't really trust these estimates. Well, isn't that bizarre? You're saying, here's we're giving this thing a Nobel Prize, but you actually can't trust the work. We think it's suggestive is the word they use, or strongly suggests, they say. They say it suggests this, and we're giving a Nobel Prize for suggesting this, but you can actually have to take this with a grain of salt. They actually use that expression, you have to take these estimates with a grain of salt. If you have to take them with a grain of salt, why are you giving it a Nobel Prize? It's astonishing the degree of non-empiricalness that is accepted in a prize given for empirical work here. Which doesn't mean that I think that Acemoglu et al. Suck at their empirical work, although some people allege they do, and there's backs and forths. So some people allege they do, and then, so what was I saying?
We were talking about the Why Nations Fail book, or suggestive. They're mostly right, or directionally right.
Yeah. So yeah. I mean, they basically they've given a prize for big think with empirics that can't really support it. And this is true of they mention other work by these guys on democracy and growth. Well, it has similar problems. I won't go into it all day, but I guess that's the point. The point is that this represents the Nobel Prize moving away from really verifiable, concrete, definite stuff, whether theory or empirics, and back toward kind of vague big think that we think is kind of cool, like what Hayek wrote.
And by the way, quick side note on Hayek. One of Hayek's big ideas, of course, was gone around sort of the decentralized system of markets being critical to discovering the true price of things. And I'm curious if you think in an AI-driven world, there will be more effective centralization of price or centralized organizations that have data and can use AI to synthesize data and make sense of it, will be able to have better price discovery. And does that cut against Hayek a little bit?
Maybe so. Certainly a number of people have postulated that, but I don't know yet. I don't know. I sort of think Hayek's right, but it's hard to, that's big think that it's hard to verify with science too. And my guess is no, because AI will generate just as much information as it analyzes, and that information will need to be aggregated by AI markets. That's my intuition, but I don't know. And yeah, and I don't even know how important the stuff Hayek talked about really is, quantitatively speaking. I think it's obvious the mechanism that he described by which markets can aggregate information. If oil gets expensive, that tells you to drill for more oil, and then you drill for more oil, and then oil gets cheaper again. That's real. We have all seen that happen. How efficient those price signals are, how many price changes reflect those signals, what they tend to be a signal of, blah, blah, blah. Those are all empirical questions that I think that Hayek didn't even try to answer, or didn't even think about trying to answer, really. And I think that, because econ was just philosophy at that point. And so, but, now for example, there's a real question as to whether or not inflation expectations motivate inflation. And macroeconomists argue about this again and again. Well, that's sort of what Hayek was talking about. Inflation expectations of prices should influence the price that you set, which should influence the actual price. There's a feedback effect. But we don't, people argue back and forth about how much that happens, how much that matters.
Yeah. The That's a segue to this piece that you wrote about AI. Well, and also Acemoglu, because one of the places it seems like you disagree with him a lot is his thoughts on AI. But also, you wrote about this idea in your piece that people often equate the strengthening of or improvement of our models with sort of the improvement of accuracy and truthiness. And you write about how this idea of, hey, maybe power and truthiness are actually not correlated. And to the extent they're not correlated, that will present opportunities for humans to, be in the value chain or add value along the way. Maybe we could start with why Acemoglu is wrong on AI, and then we could get into your nuanced view.
Well, so I don't know that Acemoglu is necessarily wrong about AI, and he's done a lot of valuable work. Remember, I think Acemoglu is primarily talented as a theorist and kind of honestly mid as an empiricist, and that his virtuosity as a theorist causes people to overbelieve in, to have too much confidence in his empirical results. So, for example, a paper he did with Pasquale Restrepo found that companies that do more automation hire fewer people, and then, or that have more industrial robots hire fewer people, and then industries where there's more industrial robot adoption hire fewer people. So they're like, okay, industrial robots destroy jobs. But then a whole bunch of other people did this with better data, and then I don't know, whatever, more companies, longer time horizons, better definitions of things, basically better data. A whole bunch of other people did this thing, and they found the exact opposite. They found that the companies that hire that buy more industrial robots actually hire more humans overall. And that has become a pretty robust finding. And it directly contradicts their empirical result, even though their empirical result got a lot more play and was a lot more influential than the subsequent many, many papers that rebutted it. And at the same time, so then they were like, okay, well, it's because those companies just become more dominant. That's why they hire more humans. But then at the whole industry level, you'd see this shift where the industries that automate more, destroy jobs. And then people looked at the industry level, and then that, the industries that automate more also gain jobs. And people are like, but the jobs are getting destroyed somewhere. The job destruction must be somewhere. And so eventually you end up doing this at the level of countries to try to look for the job destruction at sort of the most general, highest level. And at that point, you get to the point where regressions can't really find anything because like the data is too sparse. There's just not enough data points, and it's contaminated by other stuff. And at that point, you're like, okay, we declare victory because we took it to a level where we weren't able to actually get good empirical work. Therefore, our theory wins. Well, that's not very scientific. And I think that the job destroying effects of industrial robots and automation in general are just incredibly hard to find in the data. And ultimately, everyone's got a job now. So like, however much automation there's been, it didn't stop people from having jobs. Middle class wages are the highest they've ever been. Obviously, there's a counterfactual. Maybe things would be even better. Maybe middle class wages would be even better without any automation. But it's really, really hard to find the job killing effects of automation in the data. And then, and Acemoglu has often played fast and loose with this theory too. For example, he wrote a paper called The Simple Macroeconomics of AI, where basically he used theory to break AI's potential macroeconomic effects on jobs into like multiple things it could do. AI could make you more productive at the things you already do. It could just replace you flat out. It could create new things for you to do, or it could make your tools just more productive, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But the point is then the whole thing where it could create new things for you to do, he just assumes that away. He says, I assume this is zero. And then, of course, all the results say that AI destroys jobs because you've assumed away the main mechanism by which AI creates jobs. Congratulations. That, he's a talented theorist for breaking down the potential effects of AI into this very clear taxonomy that you could then potentially measure, maybe if you had good enough data. But then, as a polemicist, as a blogger, as a public intellectual, he just turns off a piece of his model in order to assume his desired conclusion that AI kills jobs. That's malpractice. And, as a blogger, that's blogger malpractice, all right? Probably, research-wise, it's not malpractice. Just you can make whatever assumptions you want, and people can decide how smart they think that is or not.
But it doesn't pass the sniff test.
No, you shouldn't do that. And then he wrote this book with Johnson, Power and Progress, that it just had a whole lot of historical howlers. Did we ever do that review on? Did we ever do?
I think we alluded to it, but we haven't done a dedicated segment on it, so we should.
Right. Okay. So a lot of it is just economic history, and basically the economic history is meant to tell the story that that tech bros want to destroy jobs, so you can't let the tech bros invent what they want. You have to force them to invent stuff that creates jobs. That's the basic message of Power and Progress.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
As a developer, the journey from concept to production-ready LLM apps is fraught with challenges. Dealing with unpredictable LLM outputs, correctly handling PII, and ballooning API costs can all be blockers to shipping your next AI-powered feature. Weights and Biases Weave is a lightweight AI developer toolkit designed to simplify your LLM app development. With Weave, you can trace and debug input, metadata, and output with just 2 lines of code. Weave helps you run rigorous evaluations and securely manage all of your data sets and system configurations, so you can focus on what matters most, iterating and improving on your LLM-powered applications. Plus, Weave integrates seamlessly with your favorite APIs and libraries, including OpenAI, Anthropic, Mistral AI, Cohere, LangChain, Llama Index, and more. Make real progress on your LLM development and visit wnb.me/cr to get started with Weave today. That's wnb.me/cr.
Hey, finance leaders, do you remember when Amazon didn't have to charge sales tax on every online purchase? Well, 10 years later, we see sales tax on e-commerce everywhere. That wave is now hitting SaaS and the digital economy, and Anrok is here to help you navigate this new tax compliance journey. As your software business grows, so does your global tax liability. But keeping up with ever-changing regulations across multiple jurisdictions can be overwhelming. That's where Anrok comes in. Anrok is the enterprise-grade solution that automates sales tax compliance worldwide. Anrok tracks your exposure, calculates tax, and handles filings all in one platform. As a Turpentine Finance listener, you can get a free Nexus study from Anrok today. See your economic and physical nexus in real time by connecting your billing and HRIS tools. You'll get a clear view of your exact exposure in any jurisdiction, plus a live review with a SaaS tax expert. Don't let tax compliance slow down your growth. Visit anrok.com/turpentine to claim your free Nexus study and take control of your SaaS tax strategy. Anrok, empowering software businesses to grow across the globe.
Our sponsor for today's episode is Carta, the end-to-end accounting platform that's purpose-built to power the strategic impact of the fund CFO. For the first time ever, private fund operators can now leverage their very own bespoke software that's designed from the ground up to bring their whole portfolio together, enabling formations, transactions, and distributions to flow seamlessly and accurately. The end result? A remarkably fast and precise platform that empowers better strategic decision-making and delivers transformational insights on demand, timely K1s, holistic fund performance data, and so much more. Come see the new standard in private fund management at carta.com/investors. That's carta.com/investors.
But we won't know what creates jobs, right? Isn't it kind of difficult to anticipate?
Yes. That is one of about 1,000 reasons why this book is just one of the worst nonfiction books I've ever read. So, for example, they say they're making a point, technology can be used for good purposes or bad purposes. And then they list new inventions that brought nothing, like shared prosperity. Here's an example. I'm quoting from Acemoglu and Johnson's book. At the end of the 19th century, German chemist Fritz Haber developed artificial fertilizers that boosted agricultural yields. Subsequently, Haber and other scientists used the same ideas to design chemical weapons that killed and maimed hundreds of thousands on World War I battlefields. In case you don't know about the Haber-Bosch process, this is what allows artificial fertilizer, which is responsible for feeding the entire world. If artificial fertilizer were not usable, if this one chemical discovery were not usable, literally billions of humans would starve to death. We could only support a population of 5 billion or 4 billion or something like that. We could not support the number of people, like billions would starve without this thing. And it's just the most important, agricultural innovation in all of history, even more important than the Green Revolution. And so they said, but because also similar chemical reactions were responsible for chemical weapons in World War I, we don't know if this is good or bad. That's intentionally dumb when you say something like that. That's the worst howler in a book full of howlers. Actually, it's just chock full of howlers. But I just can't imagine how they allowed themselves to put that on paper.
It doesn't even pass the sniff test. Yeah.
It doesn't pass the sniff test at all. And then, so anyway, I list a whole bunch of these, and I'm just like, the history in this book is just terrible. It also doesn't cite sources. It just has a it just has a bibliographic essay where they just mention all the places, that things they read to produce this book, but it doesn't connect individual assertions to individual sources, so you don't know where it came from, that's terrible. Like, how can I disprove a lot of stuff? So I had to go reading all those papers. This took me like this review took me like a week to write, because I was reading all these papers and hunting down these things because they didn't cite their sources. Anyway, I really don't like this book. Also, as power, when they define power, it's not some Marxist thing. It's actually, they just say power is the power to persuade. If you persuade people to allow you to invent job-killing technologies, you have power. Why are people able to persuade people to allow them to invent these technologies? I don't know. Maybe it's just luck. So power is like rhetorical luck to these guys. That makes no sense to me. Like, nobody thinks that's a good definition of power. And they basically think that accidental success in a nonviolent marketplace of ideas is in the same conceptual category as slavery and feudalism, which they compare it to. They say those were cases where power determined economic outcomes. Also, tech bros writing, VCs writing op-eds that reduce appetite for AI regulation, that's also power if people are persuaded by those op-eds. Well, that's dumb. How can you write that in a book and have people think you're like the top intellectual on the subject? I don't understand it. It was just terrible. And there's a whole lot of other problems. So my review is about 7,000 words. You can go read it, and then there's just like lots of things. There's empirical mistakes too. There's like the facts they claim that are just like the opposite of right. And there's lots of stuff they just don't grapple with and they just avoid. Anyway, it's bad. It's a really bad book. I didn't like it. It's fractally bad in that you'll see like a whole big claim will be bad, but you'll zoom in and see tons of tiny little incidental off-the-cuff bad claims that they didn't necessarily need to make in order to support the big bad claim, but that they make anyway just because they can, and which are bad. Yeah, I'm very frustrated. In case you can't tell, I'm really frustrated. I spent a lot of time reading this book. It's possible to frustrate me to the point where, I lose my cool, and this book just really, oh man.
7,000 word takedown. Amazing.
I want those weeks of my life back, man, bro.
And he wins a Nobel. Crazy. But let's flesh out your thoughts on AI, because they've been evolving. We've done a conversation with Dario, obviously, a month ago or so. One with Nathan Benz before. You've been writing about it, and it seems like you have some synthesis here. Or what is your kind of the latest thinking?
I don't know. I think I didn't know a couple weeks ago, and I don't know now. But I think that absolutely everybody is sort of doing a more casual version of what Acemoglu did in his paper, The Simple Macroeconomics of AI. Which is to say, absolutely everybody is simply refusing to imagine the jobs AI might create and focusing all their attention on the jobs that AI might replace. Is this appropriate? Should we assume that AI is simply a people remover, and that that's the assumption we should make, and that other things, like so many other technologies in the past, have created jobs for humans to do? Should we just assume that AI is fundamentally different, and that AI is the people remover? Remember that a lot of those old technologies people thought would function primarily as a people remover as well, ex ante, right? People thought that like steam shovels would displace all the construction workers, and people thought that like factories would displace everybody. People thought that like there's a lot of these examples of technologies that people just thought like there'll be nothing for humans to do, and then there were. Now that doesn't mean the future will be like the past. We have no assurance that the future will look like that, right? In fact, I think there's a very good argument to be made that there's a difference in the job effect between the first and second sort of computer revolutions. In the first in the 80s and 90s, and the second in the like late 90s and 2000s, I think internet technology looks like it behaved differently than database technology. Those are the two big things, by the way, that the two big ways computerization affected business. Databases meant you could just sort of, you moved all your office work to digital stuff. And then like Excel, spreadsheets to Excel, and that was huge. Like, Oracle exists because it held people's hands. SAP exists, right? Because they hold people's hands and they teach them how to use databases. That was like the first B2B, IT software stuff was database. Teach a company how to put their shit on a computer. That was your first wave. And your second wave was teach companies how to use the internet. And so when you get to internet stuff, I think there's actually some decent evidence that this on net killed jobs and reduced wages for middle-class people. That the internet, that the technology that Acemoglu et al. Believe that AI is, the internet is the actual that. And I have some half-baked hypotheses as to why that's true. I think that the internet, primarily what it does is it allows you to, that a lot of human labor was local redundancy. You'd have like salesperson in every county, right? Because you had to be on the ground. And now the internet allows you to just blast stuff out, just one person behind a computer blast it out to a million people. So I think that my suspicion is that delocalization, that a lot of human labor was local redundancy, and that the internet got rid of a lot of that. And therefore, that's why it had ultimately, so far, I think the internet has largely had a job, not a necessarily job destroying effect, but certainly in promoting inequality. And so I think that a lot of times economists and also pundits tend to fight the last war. They tend to look at the last big technology that came through and think that the next big one will be just like that. And I think that that's why everyone was complacent about the internet. Everyone thought, oh, well, computers have done, like everybody's got a desk, everybody's got an email job now with computers. Everybody's got a job. Just, people used to just write these things on paper and put them from the inbox into the outbox, right? Now you just have a digital inbox and digital outbox. Now you just do Excel. You type things in Excel. It's great, still work for people to do, and that's going to be fine. It's just going to make people more productive at their existing tasks. And I think that people were in 2004, people were incredibly complacent about what the internet would do to human labor because the computer revolution had gone well. And now I think the internet revolution, did not go great for human labor, although I think that's a very general statement and I think not always true. Obviously, many new jobs are created, like digital marketing consultant. Like that wasn't a job before. So those new jobs are created, and I won't say the impact of the internet was uniformly bad, but I think that overall it probably promoted more inequality. I think internet made the world a bit more unequal, also by like outsourcing, offshoring, all that stuff it facilitated. And so I think that everybody expects AI to do this, partly because we've inundated ourselves with science fiction stories about AI that does this, but also partly because that's how the last thing went. Like we're fighting the last war here, opinion-wise. And I think we do that all the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just because I do have to leave early, we have a couple minutes left. Is there anything we haven't yet covered on this topic or a previous topic we spoke about that's worth making sure we get into?
Well, sure. So I guess in economics, one big problem is that the glamour divisions are not the most reliable in terms of science. And this is why people think econ isn't a science, because the economics that they interface with, that they see in their daily lives, is the least scientific part of it. They see people prognosticating about inflation, which is very, very hard to forecast for anyone. They see people prognosticating about growth and employment, which are very, very hard to forecast. They see people making big pronouncements about why nations fail and why nations succeed, and growth, and all these big things. These economists making these grandiose pronouncements and promoting these big theories. And then, those theories are big and vague enough where you can certainly find casual evidence to say, oh, look, that didn't happen. Or you can look at individual inflation forecasts and say, oh, look, that didn't happen. These are the glamour divisions of economics because they grapple with the big, big questions. And I'm not saying you shouldn't grapple with the big questions, okay? I'm not saying you should focus only on the things you can get solid answers to and then ignore all the other questions. Don't ever think about why nations get rich because you'll never know for certain. Don't ever think about why, whether institutions are good because you can never know for certain. No, I'm not saying any of that. You should grapple with these big questions. But the fact that the people who are getting much more solid, reliable answers and making much more solid, reliable theories in economics are not getting the attention that the big think people do and that the big macro people do. Macro gets all the attention. And then micro, which is like most of economics, and which gets incredibly solid results and often generates many, many billions of dollars in corporate value and like improves lives in any number of ways and makes all kinds of policies better, does all these like things like this humble, effective plumbing or dentistry, as Keynes called it. This dentist economics is actually by far more common and often involves harder math, honestly. And yet it gets results. It really gets results. And I'm frustrated because people think economics is this branch of woo-woo philosophy, which in the past led people to think economics is just a whole bunch of free market libertarian bullshit. And in the future, we'll get people to think, oh, economics is just a bunch of like commie anti-technology bullshit, right? Already all the VCs and tech people are just looking at the Acemoglu stuff. They're being like, what is this guy on? What he's on is big think, right? And people thinking econ sucks because it's all about this big think. I don't want to say big think's bad, but I do think that I was happy with the way the Nobel Prize was foregrounding the humble, effective stuff over the vague, big think, fun, indeterminate stuff. And this looks to be a reversal. We'll see if it's a permanent reversal. We'll see where the Nobel Prize goes in future years. It may be that Acemoglu is kind of a one-off. He's the only macroeconomic theorist, the vague, big think guy who's like influential and well-published enough where he pretty much had to get the Nobel Prize. And now, like, after that exception, they'll go back to people doing more humble work. That's possible, especially because there's just a lot fewer guys doing the kind of stuff that Acemoglu does in econ now that it's shifted to empirics. There's fewer would-be Acemoglus than there used to be by quite a lot. And so it may be that the Nobel Prize will just snap back and this is just a one-time anomaly and blah, blah. Or it may be that whoever's in the Nobel Prize committee has just decided, you know what, these critics are right. And, guys like Deaton and Pritchett and guys who said that we weren't rewarding big think enough are right. We need to start awarding more big think. And we might see a shift back toward grandiose, unverifiable big think as the thing that gets rewarded in the economics profession. I hope we don't, because I like science and I think, big think is necessary, but science is cooler.
Yeah. Well, that's a great note to wrap this podcast on. Is a good discussion on economics as a science. Noah, as always, until next time.
Until next time.
Econ 102 is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, In the Arena, The Cognitive Revolution, and more. If you like what you hear, subscribe and leave us a review in the App Store. You can keep up with both of our Substacks for written analysis of the topics we cover in the show at noahopinion.substack.com and erictornberg.substack.com. Thanks for listening.